So to kick us off, first of all, thank you all for joining this talk on developing a best-in-class policy for deprecating your APIs. To just really jump into it, real quick, by show of hands, how many of you have ever worked with a platform or called an API that didn't behave exactly like you might have expected it to? Really? No, that makes sense. Maybe it sounds a little something like this. You log onto your computer on a Monday morning, you throw on your favorite playlist, you're kind of easing into your week, you go to access the same piece of software that you use every week. But this time you see something like this. Essentially, one of your core services is throwing 400 errors, it's not responding, despite no recent changes on your end. Maybe you and your team spend the next 2 hours trying to debug this, only to realize that a dependent service you rely on has actually been deprecated. How frustrating is that? Well, it's very frustrating, yes, but it's also entirely avoidable. So API deprecations and the policies that surround them are a critical area where trust is built or lost with developers who rely on your services, sometimes as the backbone of their own. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk us through how to develop a best-in-class policy that honors transparency and hopefully avoids the pitfalls of frustrating situations like this. First, a bit about me. So I'm a senior developer advocate at Miro. I've been in the API and developer relations spaces for the better half of the last decade at Miro, Zoom, Meetup, and a few others. And I've learned a lot over the years about deprecations and some of the common pitfalls that can happen. So I'm really excited to distill some of that for you all today and walk through why we deprecate things and how to do it the right way. So these are a few of the themes that I want to touch on quickly. So first, deprecation. What is it and why do we do it? Developer trust. I'm going to touch on this a lot. It's really at the core of this type of policy. Execution. We'll talk about a concrete example. And retirement. That is, the ultimate goal of what any policy like this aims to achieve. So let's start with a quick question. What exactly is deprecation? I think Twitter does a really good job, or Twitter did a really good job of, defining deprecation versus retirement, precisely because they're so clear and concise about how they're defining it. There's no ambiguity. And, the most important aspect of developing a clear, thoughtful policy is that the subject matter is concrete and universally understood by anyone who's reading your policy. So, they say that deprecation is a period in time where essentially if something is not necessarily the recommended method anymore, but it's still accessible. But if you find bugs, don't expect them to fix it. They define retirement as actually it's no longer possible to use that anymore. So while I chose to use Twitter's definition here, the reality is that there's a lot of different terms thrown around for the end of life of an API. So for our purposes today, we're going to talk about this first period where no longer recommended method, not officially supported, but yes, you can still use this endpoint. And we're going to define retirement as actually it's no longer viable, it's impossible to use this endpoint. So we have these agreed upon definitions for deprecation versus retirement, but why do we deprecate APIs in the first place? Well, we deprecate APIs in the first place because any healthy API or service should be constantly evolving. The capabilities in your APIs today could very well be outdated, irrelevant, maybe even no longer necessary to your product in time. And that's exactly where deprecation comes in. We need a way to offload the time and resources that we're spending on these older versions so that we can focus on evolving our latest and greatest versions. So we understand what deprecation is and why we do it. But how do we actually create a policy that achieves this? Well, it all starts and hinges on developer trust. So this is the single biggest risk when it comes to developing this type of policy. Why, you might ask, or you might not ask, but I'll tell you anyways. You're making a formal commitment, so to speak, down on paper that your APIs are going to function or stop functioning exactly when you say they will. And developers who rely on your APIs, like I said earlier, they might rely on this as the backbone of their own product or their own service. So any missteps or miscommunications, they're going to be felt downstream. More succinctly, developer trust is directly tied to business impact. So how do we avoid this risk? Well, we avoid this risk by avoiding ambiguity. And I think we're all probably kind of familiar with what this might look like. This looks like unclear timelines. So you might hear people say, oh, well, we'll talk about deprecating that in Q3, or, oh, we'll worry about the strategy for that next year. You need to have a firm timeline in mind. This might look like a lack of internal consensus. So, droves of meetings with no concrete takeaway, no point person to take something from, ideation to fruition. This might look like undocumented behavior. So product or engineering changes that went out without any kind of external communication, leading to a really poor developer experience. And it's really important to call these out because we have to remember that the intention of this policy is to, secure trust and be hyper aware of these risks. Outside of just feature sets and capabilities, the reason developers choose your product or your APIs is because they have faith in your decision making and your judgment calls. And this relies on us making, clear, actionable commitments and letting them know that we have them top of mind. And it's really important to get this right because you only get one shot. You might get more than one shot, but I don't recommend taking multiple shots. So if your policy contains any of these ambiguities that we just talked about, developers are going to immediately start losing trust in your APIs and your product. And actually, in many ways, being aware of these risks is almost equally as important as knowing what success looks like. If all goes well, retirement should be fairly uneventful. You shouldn't really hear anything. But if all doesn't go well, it's kind of the exact opposite. You can rest assured that you're going to hear something. And all it takes is one developer and their bad experience for your reputation to be on the line. So what concrete steps can we take to make sure that this doesn't happen? So let's talk execution. Up until this point, we've talked about the good versus bad, what deprecation looks like, but somewhat in a theoretical sense. So now I want to walk us through a quick case study, and this starts with the assembly of our primary stakeholders. So, well, it's true of, almost any strategic initiative within an organization that you need to work cross-functionally. This is extremely important in this context because deprecations affect all of these different parts of an org. Engineering, product, customer success, they all have something, at stake. And you really need one person to hold point on convening these different groups. This might be developer relations, as is the case with Miro, but this could be anyone. This could be a product manager, an engineering lead, really just somebody who has empathy for developers and acknowledges the impact of what a deprecation will actually have, on their integrations and on their day-to-day. So, what challenges should these working groups be thinking about? Well, these are what I'm gonna, call the big three, and I think they're the three, main components to be concerned about. So first, timelines. When can we be certain, or as certain as possible, that our next version that's going to replace our current one is actually going to be ready? And from there, we can kind of start reverse engineering our timeline. So, okay, if we think that our new version will be ready sometime next year, and we need to have our deprecation policy published before that, even before that, we need to have customer communication ready. Going back further, a draft. Before that, that working group should be convened. You kind of get the idea here. The next thing is dependencies. So what are the things that we're not thinking about or the things that we don't know about right now? This might be things like shifting business priorities, things that you can't foresee, but things that could change on your roadmap. This might be, taking into account feature parity or your best effort to get there. And lastly, messaging. This one's really important. Messaging to customers needs to be well-informed, give them a sense of timing, and also acknowledge impact. So these are the three, big things to be thinking about internally. but there's also outside influences as well. So, like any good plan, it is invaluable to know how others before us have tackled the same challenge. This is especially important if you are perhaps a younger organization, a startup, maybe you haven't ever had to deprecate a service before. At Miro, when we came up with our deprecation policy, we had a good sense of what we needed to accomplish. We had in-house experience with this, but we still took the time up front to do our due diligence and make sure that we were looking at the landscape. And actually, this process should raise more questions. It should raise questions like, should our deprecation policy be part of our terms of service? Should a deprecation policy be, accompanied by a versioning policy? How long should the deprecation period be? These are all questions that are somewhat unique to your organization and also your product. So my advice here is if you're looking at the landscape, take into account what makes sense, but don't feel like you have to take everything that exists in some other policy. If you're a smaller organization, everything that Twitter's laid out is probably not necessary. So with this in mind, let's take a look at our Miro deprecation timeline. So before I get into the granularity here, just for a bit of context. So at Miro, we had a V1 developer platform, which consisted of a lot of legacy APIs and a web plugin, and we rebuilt it from scratch. And so we needed a way to handle getting rid of it via deprecation, and that's why we had to come up with this policy. End to end, coming up with this policy took us probably 6 months or so, and as with most things, this probably could have been done quicker, but it's really important to call out that you need to invest the time and resources up front in this kind of strategy so that you're not making hasty decisions at the 11th hour. The other thing we did here, which you'll see on the timeline in the next slide, that I think is really important, is we streamlined communication as best we could. So that meant we actually launched our V2 platform and announced the deprecation of our V1 platform at the same time. So let's take a closer look. So as we were talking about earlier, we started by convening a working group and having those initial conversations among stakeholders. We also brought in that external landscape and market research. And that's actually what informed the rest of the timeline. So you see over here on the right-hand side, sometime in 2023, we're going to retire our V1 platform. And the thing I want to call out before that is that before retirement, we have baked in this period of time for monitoring and adoption of our V2 platform, as well as our best effort at achieving feature parity. And this is actually where one of another big risk lies, which is in prematurely retiring an endpoint. So you don't want to shut off critical infrastructure for developers just to meet an internal goal. And if you have to do something like that, you need to be honest and transparent. And honesty and transparency is really what should come above all else. You want to communicate any changes accordingly, and you also want to assure devs that you're not going to make any hasty actions just to meet, again, some kind of internal goal of your own that's not putting them top of mind. I think Steve Jobs put this really well. He said, when you innovate, you make mistakes. It's best to admit them quickly and basically get on with your other innovations. I think what I'm trying to get at here is, developers, like many of us in the room, we really appreciate it when, people keep it real with us. Nobody's perfect, no organization is perfect, but it's good to be proactive and be honest about what's happening. And it's a matter of giving them as much time and information as possible to deal with those changes. So developing a policy that, requires you to be realistic, and it also requires you to know exactly what is happening in each phase of end of life, which means staying nimble and flexible where necessary. So deprecation is most of the battle when it comes to this type of policy, but nailing your retirement is the other half of the battle. So if you're looking at how your new services are performing, or how you're doing in terms of coming up with feature parity between versions, if what you're seeing differs from what you expected, then you need to potentially make some adjustments. In some ways, maybe this goes against exactly what we expect in a policy, right? A policy is supposed to be very clear, kind of strict, but it's a balance. You need to be realistic, and you need to keep developers top of mind. It's a balance between internal commitments, so those timelines you came up with early on, things that the business needs or wants sooner rather than later, versus the needs of developers. So at Miro, for us, this looked a little bit like this. It looked like keeping our history of proactive communication with customers front and center. It meant holding our engineering and product teams accountable to deliver core features that were needed in our next version of our APIs to unlock the same use cases that were already possible in our current version. And it meant committing to that feature parity almost above all else. All right, so let's just cut to the part now where we actually show you what we worked on, and that is the Miro deprecation policy. So we came up with a policy that we are quite confident in, but that's precisely because it's clear and it's actionable for developers. So I won't read this end to end, but I will call out 3 core components that I think should be included in any good deprecation policy. First, that's a concrete timeline. So at Miro, we came up with a 6 months deprecation period, and that was based on consensus among stakeholders. Some unique aspects of our business, the way that our product worked and how different it was from our previous version to our next version. If you're a big, large company and you have quite complex APIs, 6 months is probably not long enough. You probably might take years. It depends on you and your organization. Second, a commitment to developers, a commitment that they're gonna have what they need when the time comes. That might look like migration resources, or just generally, giving them an idea of what to expect. And lastly, a clear definition of deprecation versus retirement. So here's precisely how we define each phase of end of life. There should be no confusion when a developer reads your policy. It should be a roadmap for what to expect. Of course, there are other aspects that could be included in this type of policy. These 3 components are just a baseline. It would probably be great to have more detail, but it's also a balance. You don't want to over-inundate developers with jargon or language that's hard to follow. It needs to be clear, actionable, and include everything that's important to you and your product. In closing, I think if your policy has at least these 3 things, developers will know that they can trust you, your APIs, and you're on your way to a best-in-class policy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, William. Okay, so we have time for questions. As before, raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I have 2 questions, if I may. You just showed us your deprecation policy, and you decided to establish a specific timeline. What inputs did you have? Did you give more important to decide a specific timeline? And when you published this timeline to your customers, what did you give to them? Did you document something like a migration document or something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we came up with this policy, this was published before we even announced our deprecation itself, so that people could immediately come to this at that time. In terms of resources for customers, we had migration guides for each endpoint and every change in a request payload or the parameters of the URL. So basically they had a step-by-step resource to get them from the older version to the newer version.
Okay, we have time for perhaps one more question. Can you, if you have another question, you raise your hand. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Maybe I missed that. Do you know how many breaking changes you have between these 2 versions? And also, have you considered introducing a lot of small versions in between instead of having this one big bang?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did have a lot of breaking changes because this was an entirely new platform, essentially. It was a revamp of all of our API endpoints. It was quite extensive. So that was something we factored into the deprecation period itself. For us, a lot of the functionality was almost exactly the same. so 6 months seemed like ample time, but we did still call out those breaking changes in our change log and communications to developers who were registered with our platform, included it in our migration resources, so it was something we considered.